hidden costs of renting or leasing a commercial property for your business can be vast. And this is something that I have come across many times in my career working as a chartered accountant. So in this video, I will give you my 7 tips of what you need to be looking out for before you sign on the dotted line and take on a commercial property. Now, renting a commercial property is very different to renting a home, and the consumer laws that protect residential tenants do not apply to businesses. And there is also no standard or legal agreement that must be used by commercial landlords. And the landlord can pretty much put what they want into a commercial agreement. So therefore, understanding exactly what you are signing up to is incredibly important to ensure that it does not have a detrimental impact on your profit or your cash flow on a long-term basis. And being armed with this knowledge also gives you a really good opportunity to negotiate with the landlord and try and get some of the more onerous and costly clauses removed or changed. So we'll count down from number 7 to 1 on the top things that you should be checking before you sign a commercial lease. So we'll kick right off with number 7, which is very topical right now, and that is utility costs. Now, it goes without saying that when you take a building on, you would expect to have to pay the utility bills, but the energy price caps do not apply to commercial properties as they do to residential properties. So where we've seen quite high utility bills, particularly for gas and electricity, expect those to be even higher in commercial properties. It's also fairly common for the landlord to pay for the utility bills and pass these costs onto you as the tenant. Now, the landlord actually, there's no regulation to stipulate how the landlord passes these onto you and how much you can be charged by the landlord. So the landlord, for example, could choose to double the costs that they charge to you and put quite a hefty markup on there. So if the landlord is going to pay for the utilities and pass them on, you want to make sure that as a minimum you have a cost plus method stipulated in the contract. But ideally, as the tenant, you want to be responsible for sourcing your utility provider yourself, because if the landlord is just simply passing the costs on to you, there is absolutely no incentive for them to spend any time trying to find the cheapest energy provider for you. So you will always pay more utility costs if you do it this way through your landlord. So number 6 is to make sure that you have exit options written into your contract. Now, the average length of a commercial lease in the UK is 5.7 years, which is quite a lengthy time for you to have to commit to. Not only could your business be in a completely different financial situation in 5 years' time, with any luck you would have grown, and you could be in the situation where you have substantially outgrown your current property. So therefore, you need options to be able to exit the lease contract without being liable for the rest of the rent. So the most common one is to build in break clauses, and that just simply means that you have an option to terminate the contract early. So if you take a 5-year lease, it's common for there to be a 2 or 3 year break clause partway through where you can exit. As well as that, I'd always recommend that you make sure that you are able to sublet the property, particularly if you are scaling up to a newer property where you won't quite fill it in the first few years. That gives you the opportunity to maybe rent out some of your space and get some short-term income. And finally, if you do need to exit your lease agreement for any reason, then being able to assign the lease just simply means that you can find a new tenant for the property and hand the lease over to them. Now, often you will be expected to pay all of the legal fees associated with this, but this could also be a really good option for being able to exit the lease early if you need to. So make sure that you build in break clauses, subletting clauses, and that you're able to assign the lease too. Now, number 5 is often the one that catches businesses out the most, and this is the repairs clause. In the UK, it's really common that when you take on a commercial property that it has a clause that says something along the lines of fully repairing. And that means that all responsibilities to maintain the building, both interior and exterior, become your responsibility as the tenant. Now, what often catches businesses out is that actually you have a responsibility to put the building into repair rather than maintain repair. And what this means is that if you took on a building that had a leaky roof, life, you are responsible for repairing that leak, even though it existed when you took the building on. So if you are taking on a commercial lease, then ideally you want to get this clause amended so that you're only responsible for maintaining the building to its current condition, and it's always recommended that you get a structural survey completed at the start, or as a bare minimum you should have a very detailed inventory with photographic evidence that is included in the contract and agreed by the landlord. I can't stress enough how important it is that you really make sure that this is covered off in your lease, because the repair costs for a building with structural defects could literally go into hundreds of thousands if you're not careful. So you really need to be careful that you're not caught out with this. So before we continue our countdown of number 4 to 1, if you're enjoying this content and you think that it's useful, then make sure that you subscribe to my channel and also hit the like button so that we can push this type of content to other small businesses in the UK too. So number 4 often shocks many business owners, and that is stamp duty. Now, when you take on a commercial lease, there are certain rules and regulations about whether or not you have to pay stamp duty. Yes, that is stamp duty, land tax, which is similar to when you buy a residential property. It's calculated in a very different way, and honestly, the rules and regulations around stamp duty for commercial leases are really quite confusing. So I'm not going to go into them now, but this is one of the reasons why it's really important that you're using a legal person to help review the contract and help you with the agreement with the landlord and agreeing the terms and conditions. One of the things that your legal representative should be able to cover off is stamp duty, land tax. They should make sure that you complete any filings that you need to complete with HMRC, and also they will be able to advise you if any stamp duty is due on the transaction. So counting down to number 3 is service charges. So if you take on a commercial property that has any shared space with any other tenants, or for example car parking space or private roads, then it's very likely that you will be billed a portion of the service charge. And the service charge covers everything from cleaning and maintenance of internal spaces to gardening and drainage of external spaces. So really the service charges could be quite extensive, and often they can add up to a similar number to the monthly rent that you're paying. So you want to make sure that there are clauses in your agreement that cover exactly what service charges you will be needing to pay. You also want to make sure that you have visibility of the last 3 years worth of service charges, so you can see whether they are fairly consistent, whether they're peaks and troughs, and what sort of value they are. Now, RICS, which is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, does issue guidance on how landlords can pass on service charges to their tenants, but it's not legally binding, it is just guidance only. So ideally you want this mentioned somewhere in your contract to bind your landlord to following this guidance. And again, this is one of those areas that you really want to make sure that you're getting legal advice on. Now, number 2 on our countdown is buildings insurance, and as with service charges, exactly how this is calculated and passed on to you should be stipulated in the contract. It's not uncommon for landlords to get kickbacks from insurance companies, so they take a higher insurance cost and then get a rebate that is paid to them personally, and this means that this pushes your insurance costs up. You also want to try and ensure that any increase in insurance costs is linked to RPI or something similar, so that you can't have these drastic jumps year on year. And finally, number 1, my final tip on costs that you need to look out for before signing on the dotted line for any commercial lease or rent agreement is dilapidation costs. Now, this is just a fancy way of saying that as the tenant, you are responsible for putting the building back to exactly how it was when you signed that agreement. Now, I have worked with businesses where they have spent tens of thousands of pounds installing fancy mezzanines into their warehouse and putting in what they felt was upgrades to the office space and the general facilities, but they were forced to remove all of this at their cost at the end of the lease, and the removal costs were almost as much as the installation costs in the first place. So if you are taking on a property with the intention of making significant changes to it, you need to really bear this clause in mind. It's very unusual for this to be written out of a contract entirely, and so therefore the way to tackle this is to usually try and negotiate with the landlord prior to making any changes, and you can agree a scope of works that you will not have to undo at the end of the lease. If you do find yourself in the situation where the landlord is requesting that you remove some of your upgrades or changes at the end of the lease, then normally this is also an area where where you can negotiate with the landlord, and there are even external companies that will be able to help you. They will be able to come in, do a survey of the property and make recommendations of how to negotiate with the landlord and handle that situation for you so that you can try and reduce your costs as much as possible. So taking on a commercial lease in the UK can be quite nerve-wracking because there are very little laws to protect you, and the landlord can pretty much put whatever they want into a lease agreement. But it is also a really great opportunity for you as the tenant to negotiate with the landlord. So now I've given you my 7 top tips of what to check for. Make sure that you are reading through any lease agreement that you are considering and that you really go back to the landlord and challenge them as much as possible. Particularly at the moment in 2023 and thinking ahead to 2024, it is not as easy as it once was for landlords to rent commercial property for good rates and to find good stable tenants. So if you are looking at taking on a longer term lease, the chances of a landlord negotiating with you are quite high. So let me know in the comments below if you have ever been caught out with any of these hidden costs in your business, or if you're thinking about taking on a commercial lease, then let me know too what your plans are for the future. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and that will just help share more content like this with other small businesses in the UK.